So follow along here, and we'll read this together. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses.' So he called in each of his master's debtors, and he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 900 gallons of olive oil,' he replied. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings.'" Being a boss is not an easy thing. I have a couple friends that are business owners or high-ranking level officials within their workplace. And most of them will tell you that one of the worst parts of their work that they occasionally have to do is to fire people. It's the job that no one really likes. And these good bosses, they will do everything they can to train up and to encourage and to assist and to motivate their employees to get the job done the way that they need it to be done. But in spite of their best efforts, it seems not everyone wants to do it that way. Instead, some employees aren't willing, or maybe they're just not able to do that work, and eventually they find themselves out of a job, wondering what comes next. Now, I'm guessing that you or someone you know well has been on one end or the other of such an interaction like this. And maybe as you reconsider that a little bit, those situations, it stirs up some deep feelings within you. I think that's normal. Today, as we just read, our parable is a peculiar interaction of an owner and a manager. It's one where the point of this story is puzzling and it's quite surprising. Now, I want to give you some quick background information about our story as we really dive into the meat of this. In Jesus' time, it was common for wealthy landowners to hand over full control of their business to a manager. Okay, this was a long-held, it was a time-honored business practice too. If we just go back and consider the Old Testament for a minute, and we think about this guy named Joseph. His dad was Jacob, or eventually his name became Israel. Okay, this is part of the family of Israel, the nation. Okay, and Joseph, you'll remember, was the one that was sold into slavery by his brothers. Oh man. And when he ends up in Egypt, eventually he became the manager in charge of all the business affairs for a man named Potiphar, who was a really high-ranking Egyptian official. In Genesis 39:6, you'll see it here on the screen. It says this: Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So these handle all the day-to-day operations type of managers. They were quite normal throughout the biblical timeline. Now, most likely, a landowner would contract with a manager to oversee the farming of his property. And then they would share some of those profits with that manager, so that way the manager was well cared for. And this would also help the landowner know that that manager had the best interests in mind because it impacted their livelihood as well. And in the Jewish law, a manager did have complete access and complete control over all the business So, for a landowner's own conscience, having an honest manager was critical. So let's take a look we're going to look at these two main characters in Jesus' story that he shares with us. First, the shrewd manager. In English, in our language, the word shrewd is a bit troubling, right? That's an interesting word to use here. It typically means someone who is kind of tricky and cunning. And we might think of someone who is kind of privy to all sorts of loopholes, okay? But yet they're careful to make sure that their dealings are legal, but they just don't have any real concern for things like ethics, or maybe what we would say are true justice. Now, I'm not throwing shade at any lawyers, but the image that I get in my mind is often of a skilled or very crafty lawyer. Okay, that's what comes to mind here. They know all the legal things, and they're aiming to, hopefully, if they're defending you or something like that, they're going to have a favorable outcome in your favor. However, with all that thinking in our English language, in the original, okay, this is Greek language, being shrewd is actually more closely related to being clear-eyed. It's a person that is skilled enough and to act with great foresight and to do it quickly. You might remember Jesus telling a story about a wise man who built his house on the rock because he was anticipating a coming storm. You know that one? We used to sing a song about that one, okay? That is actually the same word and the same meaning here as shrewd. So literally, when we think about the wise man who built his house upon the rock, we could sing, the shrewd man built his house upon the rock. Now, for our particular shrewd guy, he was apparently caught red-handed in not doing the right things, and he had little to say for himself. Apparently, he had no defense to offer as he accepted his guilt in the matter. He was simply busted. However, being a skilled manipulator of the books, he was a savvy hustler, if you will. He designed this clever plan to gain a few friends for a beneficial payback in the future. And he was going to need some help because he was about to hit the unemployment line. The landowner said, just to refresh your mind here, give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. Now, in our present day companies and owners, they generally let an employee go, and then they immediately ask that employee to grab all their things, clean out their desk, and hit the road. And if they don't, someone's going to do it for them, right? That's how this goes. Charlie said he agrees. But our manager here is given a chunk of time. And although we're told his firing is certain, it is not quite finalized just yet. So, given his bookkeeping skills, he acts swiftly to set himself up. He understood that once word of his firing got out, he was going to have a hard time. No other landowner would ever want to hire him again. So he was in a tight spot, and time was not on his side. And what we have here in our modern day vernacular is a lame duck situation. Now, when you hear that phrase, I'm going to guess you definitely think of politicians, right, that have served during their last term. I think, because I'm a sports guy, I think of coaches that everybody knows they're just riding this one out because he's under contract till the end of the year, and then that coach is a goner. And so, in other words, when we think of a lame duck situation, just like this manager had nothing to lose now. It's as though he's saying to himself, what is he going to do? Fire me? I mean, come on. That's the worst that could happen here now. And we don't know all the ins and outs of the ancient Jewish business practices, but in regards to this plan, the shrewd manager was making use of another cultural norm that I think for us 21st century Americans, it slips past us. And it's this. It's that Jewish, and really we go back to the Mosaic, that's Moses, the law of Moses, prohibited Jewish businessmen from charging any interest to fellow Jewish folks. So when money was loaned out, it was illegal to write a bill stating any interest. So bills usually got written with just one amount. It would be the principal amount of the loan. Then any interest or any brokering fees would most often be stated in products, in materials, in commodities. things like oil and wheat instead of money. You see where we're going with this a little bit? This way, it would make the books look like they were up to par within the fabric of the law. Now, obviously, doing this made some transactions really tricky to navigate, and so being sharp-witted in brokering deals was certainly a needed skill in order to get a return in business trades. So what this shrewd manager was likely doing when he lightened the debts, he was actually marking down the amount of the loans by discounting the interest that was charged, the oil and the wheat. And since these interest charges were not legal in the Jewish law, if it was $1, the landowner had no course of action against him and the ones that had been loaned to. So you can see where he's sneaky. This dude knows what he's doing. The manager had tied the landowner's hands, and it was lawfully legitimate. And he even set himself up to be remembered kindly in his own coming time of need. And that is because in Jewish culture, generous favors were expected to be repaid. The ones in debt in this parable who benefited from this clever maneuvering, they understood that. And they would be obligated to repay the shrewd manager down the road. Okay, so that's about the shrewd manager. You can see now a little bit bigger picture. This dude had made a pretty quick-acting, smart plan. Now, the interesting landowner is where the shocker of the story comes into play. The interesting landowner there, Dave, you can throw up there. And this landowner commended the manager for his shrewdness. Not that. I can go back. Keep going, backwards. There we go. Whew, we got it. Here we go. Now the interesting landowner is where we're heading now. The owner commended the manager for his shrewdness. Okay, that's right. He told him. He did clever work, right? Now I want to give a side note here. I don't think he was necessarily thrilled. Just because you compliment someone on something they did doesn't mean you're excited about it, because it cost him some materials coming back to him. But he was impressed. And I don't know about you, but as I encounter this story, I sure wish I could hear exactly how Jesus told this story. Is it possible that these words could have been soaked in some sarcasm? It's a weird thought to think that Jesus might have been a little sarcastic. Is Jesus here giving that little bit of a wry smile, saying, do you really think that this guy's going to get away with it? It seems that this part of the parable was intended to stun and to perplex us a bit. And the honest answer to that is, yeah, it does. Now, as Pastor Tom said 2 weeks ago, as he was joined with us and got us kind of rolling on this, he said that the parables can lose the original shock factor because we've either heard them so many times or we don't understand the culture behind the story. That's true. But this parable is a little different. The surprise in this story really just slaps us across the face every time we read it. I don't think there's any overlooking it. We cannot help but shake our heads and say, did Jesus just encourage people to be tricksters? But we must be reminded here that these figurative words within the story are not explicit instructions from Jesus. Instead, Jesus was using his freedom to paint us a picture, a story. He was not praising the offense here or the manager who devised it, but Jesus was expressing approval for his ingenuity. And you catch this as Jesus goes on to say that people of the world are smarter with money than his followers are. That's a big statement from Jesus. It seems that using what you have in life for eternal gain is at least part of the message of the story. Now let me remind you now here out of verses 8 and 9, just a refresher here as we're a little ways in. It says this, it says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. It's in these two verses that our author Luke really drives home what the story is and isn't about. He helps us to see that this is a parable, not a moral teaching about money and how to specifically use it, which I'm going to be honest, that's how I've always read this, and that's how I've heard this parable taught. But that's not what's going on. Yes, there are maybe some principles in play here, but that mostly confuses the point. For us, we must go deeper inside the context of this ancient Jewish tale about a landowner and a manager. And when we dive in deep, we begin to see what is most likely, because with parables it's hard to be certain, but we see what most likely it is all about. See, the landowner here, the master, is God. The manager is Israel. From the beginning of time, God's people, the nation of Israel, were to be God's managers of the world. They were the stewards of His creation. They were the keepers of His property. They were the ones chosen to shine as the light of the world. They were supposed to be a city on a hill. They are a collective of people responsible to God, and they are empowered over His earth. But as we have seen so many times throughout the Old Testament, and then even in the gospel accounts, Israel has often failed in this task. And Jesus keeps reminding them that they are moving closer to a removal from exclusively holding that office. They are in a bit of a lame duck situation themselves. Things are changing. There is a new way. There is an arriving kingdom. And up until this point, Jesus is on the scene. The religious answer to all of these changing tides, one that was carried out by the Pharisees and the religious elites, their response had been to tighten the reins of the law and of the commandments. And in this way, they tried to make the Jewish nation, God's chosen people, even more holy. But if we know anything about Jesus' ministry, this tactic from the Pharisees only served to exclude the very people that Jesus was actually reaching out to most and welcoming into His presence. You see, restricting people wasn't what the God in flesh, Jesus, had in mind. Jesus is signifying that Israel is facing a major crisis point. And the answer isn't to buckle down even more, reverting to the old systems in their former failed ways. It is not to continue on with business as usual. Rather, the better way forward is to go all in. It is to bet the farm, maybe quite literally. It is to seize the opportunity and make friends however they can and wherever they can. And he says that this is what the smart and the crafty and the insightful people of the world do best. And what the people of the light are so reluctant to do or so reluctant to try. Now, there's this whole thing with money, and I think Jesus uses money here to drive this home because all people are very familiar with it. All of us need some level of money in order to live and to survive. And yet, all of us know very well, right, how fleeting, how temporary it all is. The youth group's about ready to go to IYC. I know some parents that know how fleeting those dollars are. You see, Jesus knew this too. And as you notice, he acknowledges this reality as he stated in our text, when it is gone. He is affirming that yes, money has value here and now. But soon there will be need of something better, something that will endure, something that will last through life's difficulties. So if this parable seems to be specifically directed at this very direct situation of first century listeners that Jesus is talking to, well, what do we make of it for our own present reality? In other words, what does it say to us today? Well, does anyone have a sense that we're living in tumultuous times? Do you perceive that we aren't quite through these difficulties just yet? Is your gut feeling telling you that somehow we need to seize this moment for good? As Jesus was telling these listeners, rather than imposing even more religious regulations and imposing even more harsh judgments upon each other during difficult times, instead of reverting to former paths, maybe we should actually practice love, giving abundantly to those around us. Maybe we should be working to lighten their load. Perhaps now is the time to think a bit unconventionally, to throw out all of our fear-filled hesitancies. Maybe each of us should be prepared to make new friends by tearing down the old barriers. We do this all in the hope that we can discover the truest fellowship with others through the freeing gospel message of Jesus, which will last now and right on into eternity. So as we find ourselves living in these turbulent times, how can we use shrewdness to reassess what matters most and what does not? So here's our actionable step for today. I want us to take an inventory. You see, this parable is asking us to consider and to really examine the way that each of us has stewarded our lives. We need to honestly assess the tired, old ways that we too often fall back on that aren't shrewd. They are not wise. I want us to consider just a few of these common ones quickly. The first one is this: judgmentalism. We could also just call this being hypercritical. The religious elite in Jesus' day, and if we're going to really cut to the chase here together, in our day too, like to fancy themselves as gatekeepers. And they do this as a way of distinguishing or separating themselves from the rest of the crowd. And we do this because it keeps us all comfy, keeps us nice and cozy while we get to look down on other people. But I want to remind all of us, and Matt Stone today, that there is nothing shrewd, there is nothing wise about being judgmental. It lacks any lasting benefit for ourselves and for others. And another thing we fall back on often is indifference. I mean, the truth is we all enjoy what comes easy. And what comes easy to us is almost always what we already know, what we already believe, and what we already think. And when we never want to lean into learning new things and new approaches, it is easy to just get plain old lazy. And the truth is our spiritual lives are no different. It's easy for us to hit the snooze button in our living, and we just convince ourselves that we can make up for it, later in the day, later in the week, maybe in 5 years, sometime down the road. It's just too common for us to feel sheltered in the family of God, so much to the point that we move into apathy, where we don't pursue growth in our own lives, and we aren't moved to share real, messy love with others. And then the third thing that we fall back on way too easily is grumbling. Oh, man. Would you consider yourself to be a complainer or a grouch? That's a harsh thing to... I saw a couple hands. I won't call out those names. That's good. That's just between you and me. I like that. Maybe you don't like to consider yourself, but here's a better question. Would any of your friends or family call you a whiner or a cynic? Many of us seem to think, and we've kind of believed, that grumbling is a basic requirement of being human. Maybe you are there, and you find yourself complaining significantly more than giving effort towards finding real satisfaction in life. Quick side note, I want to remind you that the Israelites who wandered in the desert for 40 years, you know what their sin was? Grumbling. They didn't get to see the promised land. There were people that passed away without seeing it because they were the biggest grumblers. You want to see something good? Stop the grumbling. You see, if any of these are relatable to any of us, and we have just listened to this perplexing parable, folks, it is time to change. We cannot do business as usual. The church cannot keep holding back and tightening the reins. We can't do that. So what are ways can we actually practice? What are a few ways that we practice being wise and we practice being shrewd in the world? I want to offer you 3 quick notes on this. The first one is this. We need to move in a deliberate pace. Now the reality is this, is that sometimes you need to act quickly, right? As I already talked about, being shrewd in the original Greek is being clear-eyed, being able to move quickly. That's a big piece of this. So sometimes we do need to act quickly, but we should never be hurried. We can choose the pace at which we live our life. And you've heard me talk about this many times, so I will not belabor this one point. But we have talked about margin at least 5 times in the last 2.5 years. We have to build in margin. That means you will have to say no to some things so that you can say yes to the better things, and then you aren't hurried, but you can act quickly because you're shrewd with your time. You're wise with it. A second thing is that we need to invest in real relationships with people who can help provide some self-awareness for each of us. These are people who we are well known for being honest and authentic, and they're filled with kindness and love. They're those people that you know who care deeply for others, and they have a positive impact on them. We need to invest in those kinds of relationships. Then last, my other note here to you of how we can be shrewd is to be a blessing to someone else. We need to build up this habit of looking for ways to make a difference in someone else's life. And the good part about this one is it doesn't just help them along. It doesn't just bring joy to them. It actually is very fulfilling for us. But on top of all of that, it honors God. Think about that. The greatest 2 commandments that Jesus gives us are one and the same. It's love God and love others. We bring honor to God by loving other people. And the cool part about that, when we're a blessing to someone else, it also gets our minds off of all of my problems and my issues. I want to leave you with this. This is from the Apostle Paul. In discussing how we should be living with others in mind, he says this in Romans 10. It says, "But how can people call for help if they don't know who to trust? And how can they know who to trust if they haven't heard of the one who can be trusted? And how can they hear if nobody tells them? And how is anyone going to tell them unless someone is sent to do it?" That's why Scripture exclaims, "A sight to take your breath away. Grand processions of people telling all the good things of God." It is a tense time right now. We all feel it. But we cannot go on as business as usual. We cannot get caught up in judgmentalism and indifference and grumbling. Because how will people know unless God's family, the managers of all that He has created, go and tell all the good things of God? That's our work. That's our marching orders. That's what it means to be shrewd. So I know that word's a little bit weird in our language, but let's be shrewd people, because the time's now. Would you pray with me? Lord, we are thankful for